Hi friends, this is Sonila from Mediterranean and Latin loveaffair.com. Today I want to show you how I make Albanian Byrek with spinach. I make the spiral version with homemade phyllo dough. So let's start by preparing the dough first. I start by adding 4 cups of all-purpose flour on a mixing bowl. Then I mix about 2 cups of water, lukewarm water. It's very important for the water to be warm. Then I add salt and about 2 tablespoons of olive oil in the water. Mix it up. I create a well in the flour and then start adding the water in and create the dough. It can take a few minutes to create the dough. I just don't want to bore you with the process because it looks the same. But you're supposed to get a very consistent dough and then knead it for about 5 to 6 minutes. The dough is supposed to become elastic. It's supposed to become stretchy. Kneading the dough is very important because it will activate gluten and this will help us stretch the layers of phyllo once we make them. Once the dough is ready, I usually add it in a clean mixing bowl and I cover it with a kitchen towel and I let the dough rest in my kitchen in a warm spot. The second step is to prepare the filling for this spinach pie. So I start by cleaning up the spinach. Usually I try to wash it the night before or I buy triple washed spinach. I prefer using baby spinach, it's easier to work with. Then I just remove the stems and cut it in half and add the spinach to a bowl. You can use anywhere from 300 to 500 grams of spinach depending how big your phyllo pie is going to be. Then I get a whole bunch of dill. I remove the stems and I chop it really fine and add the dill over the spinach. And I finally add some salt to the spinach. It can be anywhere from half a tablespoon to a whole tablespoon of salt, and that will depend on how salty your feta cheese is, but more about that later. Then I get a whole bunch of green onions. I remove the top part of the onion, I peel them, and then I wash them thoroughly. Once the onions are washed, then I chop them, roughly chop them. They don't need to be very fine, just roughly chop them, and add the onions over the spinach and dill. At this point, I mix using my hands. I mix the spinach, dill, onions, and salt. This process will lower the volume of this filling and it will make sure that all the flavors are incorporated with each other. Then I add about 10 to 12 ounces of feta cheese. I try to use block feta and then I crumble it myself. I add 2 to 3 tablespoons of Greek yogurt as well as 2 whisk eggs. Using a wooden spoon, I mix all these ingredients for the filling very well together and I set the bowl aside. At this point, we have the phyllo dough and we have the filling for the pie. However, with the phyllo dough, we need to separate it in layers and stretch each layer separately. This process is not necessary if you're using frozen phyllo layers. That will make your dish a lot easier. I'm just trying to demonstrate a traditional dish and how I grew up making this phyllo pie. And for us, it was very important to make homemade phyllo layers. We call it the hapash pet. In my Albanian, in my native language, and it was typical of how we made phyllo pies back in my native country when I was growing up. We didn't even have the frozen phyllo layers available, so I didn't know for the longest time how to make the phyllo pie using frozen layers. So if you take the phyllo dough that you made earlier and you separate it in about 12 to 13 pieces, then you need each of those smaller pieces, we call them kulach, if you need each of those separately, and then you place them on a clean platter and cover them with a kitchen towel. So we'll start stretching each and single one of those layers one by one. The way to do it is you get a clean surface and you get some cornstarch. Usually I get a bowl of cornstarch as well as a rolling pin. The rolling pin I'm using that you see here on the video is an Albanian rolling pin called oklai. Maybe some people might call it pets, so there are different ways of calling this, but it's a thinner rolling pin than the ones we use here in United States. The reason for this is that you want to stretch the phyllo layers as big as you can. Obviously there are a lot of Albanian moms who make these phyllo layers in an amazing shape, perfect round. I definitely cannot make them that perfect, but I try to make them as thin as possible, and that works to make the pie. Then I fold the corner of one of the stretched layers. I add the filling in a line across it, and then I roll it over. Once you have one of these phyllo layers rolled over, then you can put it kind of like in a Danish shape in a baking tray that is oiled with olive oil. It prevents the phyllo pie from sticking, or byrek. So then you continue stretching each phyllo layer one by one using cornstarch and the rolling pin. It takes some practice in the beginning to get this right, but once you get used to it, the work flows. You can get the whole thing done in about 45 minutes once you gain some practice. But in the beginning, it can get tricky because the phyllo layers will sometimes stick, and you can use a little bit more cornstarch to prevent it from sticking, and maybe you won't be able to stretch it perfectly, but keep trying, you'll make it. It just takes some practice. Once you roll each phyllo layer, you fill it with the spinach filling and feta that you prepared earlier, and you just keep rolling on the baking tray one by one until you have filled the whole baking tray. You can use different shapes of baking trays. I find this specific one to be very similar to what we used to use back home. I'll put a link to it in the description. It's a deep dish pizza baking tray, but it works perfectly for byrek as well. Once you have finished preparing the baking tray and you have all the layers stretched and filled with the spinach filling, then you have to start brushing olive oil over everything. And you need to be very generous with olive oil, because on the spiral phyllo, we didn't put any olive oil in between the layers. If you are making a flat spinach phyllo pie, like a spanakopita, you are brushing each layer as you are layering the phyllo pie. But in the spiral case one, we didn't add any olive oil until the end, so be very generous with it. We bake it at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for about 50 minutes. The first 30 minutes I just check it often, but I make sure it doesn't get burned, that it gets to the golden brown color, and then I add aluminum foil over the tray and continue baking it till the end. You want to get to this crunchy filling. It's just amazing. To die for. Crunchy, delicious, amazing. I love it. It's one of my favorite foods. Thank you so much for watching my video. Let me know in comments if you have any questions in English, in Albanian, anything. And thank you again.